Get your ticket for Monerotopia in Mexico City on May 5th, 6th, and 7th, 2023. That's monerotopia.com to get for more info. Welcome to the party, pal. I have Norman Singleton, who was on Ron Paul's staff for many years. He was also a volunteer, and he's been working for fighting the good fights in the D.C. area for a long time. We're going to talk about Ron working with and working for Ron Paul. How you doing, Norman?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Okay, Norman. Let's go to the beginning here. How did you become interested in Ron Paul? How did you become interested in freedom in general?
I was an economics major in college, and my professor happened to be a Austrian, of more libertarian conservative Austrian. And I remember one day in class, he made a comment about farm subsidies, and I raised my hand and said, well, isn't it true that if we didn't have farm subsidies, we would have problems with the food supply? Because that's what I'd always been taught in my government run education. And he explained to me that actually what farm subsidies do is they subsidize big corporations and they subsidize marginal farmers who would be better off using their time, money, and talents in another field. And a light bulb went over my head and said, I wonder what else the government's been lying to me about. And that kind of led me, along with his kind of mentorship, through a path that led from National Review to Reason Magazine to more, shall we say, hardcore materials, ending up at then Mises and then Rothbard, Foundation for Economic Education. And along that way, I heard about this guy named Ron Paul, who was running for president on the Libertarian Party ticket. And I read everything I could about him, which was, I had it a lot more difficult than people who discovered Ron when they were in college 20 years after I had graduated, because I didn't have the internet. I had to rely on back copies, whatever print publications I could find, which was largely Reason and Liberty Magazine, and maybe National Review sometimes. But anyway, so I became a fan of Ron's. I went to law school. I was involved in the Federalist Society. After law school, I decided I really wanted to be involved in policy and politics. I came to DC, did some work in DC, and when I found out that Ron was running again, I called a couple of friends of mine who were involved with some of Ron's past efforts, most notably Lou Rockwell and Bert Blumert. And Lou had talked to Ron and got me a volunteer job doing some opposition research for Ron. Then I did the traditional, volunteer work, passing out literature, sign waving, and other types of just grassroots campaigning. Yeah. Ron won. He hired me, and I came to work in January of '97. He stayed there through his entire tenure of Congress. So I was there through the end of the Gingrich era, the impeachment of Clinton, 9/11, everything that followed 9/11, the revolution of 2000, 2008, the Obama years, Obamacare, and the 2012 campaign, the blimp, of course, and just really very interesting and exciting times. And now I'm at a place called the Market Institute, where I'm largely having to fight, unfortunately, both Democrats and Republicans, which actually not that unfamiliar position for me or for any libertarian, but I'm fighting this new trend that's kind of popped up on the right, and the post-liberal, what calls itself the post-liberal right, is one of the things that they want is the right to kind of forget everything that not just the Austrians have taught us, but also what the Chicago School had accomplished in terms of, if not abolishing antitrust, at least making its focus on, can you show that this is actually going to harm consumers before you bring the government in to stop a merger or an acquisition or something like that, rather than just the old way of saying like, well, they're big, so therefore they're bad, and their monopolies are unshakable. And there's just so much, economic ignorance, and a lot of it just stems from this irrational fear of big tech. And I understand that. I'm not going to defend everything that Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos has done, but look at the layoffs. Look at the stock market prices. I mean, you're going to tell me that companies like Amazon and Meta that are having to hemorrhage employees that are watching their stock prices drop, and they're going to be the big. They're a big threat, existential threat to our free market system and our democracy.
Yeah,
maybe the threat, and it's the same thing with TikTok. I still agree with I think it was Chertoff who said that. Actually, it might even have been Barry Goldwater who said this.
Frank Chodoroff, yeah.
The socialists or communists that I'm afraid of aren't in Moscow or Beijing; they're in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, well, the socialists and communists have no, they have no power over us. I mean, unless they intellectually subvert our institutions, which a lot of people believe they have. That's very interesting because, Norman, what do you think that was done right with Ron Paul? And I guess the question is, how do we, instead of having one Ron Paul, how do we get 10 Ron Pauls or 20 Ron Pauls? I mean, what was done? What is there a way to get, or is Ron Paul just a fluke?
I don't know if he was a fluke or a historical figure or a historical, I think the word standout, because Ron offered a very unique mixture of one very principled individual who came to Washington with a very specific goal. And his goal was literally to have a platform in which to talk about the dangers of the current course of the government.
Yeah.
And one of the first things he told us in our first staff meeting in '97 was, I've always seen my mission here as primarily an educational one, because he understood that where we were then and probably where we still are is our main job is to build up that critical mass of people who know the truth so that they can be that irate, tireless minority that can really change things. And the minority, it can't be a minority of 2%. Maybe when we get to 40%, but that was always his job. And and also someone who was highly principled to stick to his guns on everything. Someone who was understood the philosophy, the economics, and the history. Very intellectually curious, and he read Mises and Hayek and Rothbard in medical school to unwind from his medical studies. So he's very interested in these issues. He maintains an interest in these issues. There's that. And as for getting 20 more of those, I think what it takes is just to continue to build the movement, spread the word.
Yeah.
And because one of the things that Ron always said was most politicians aren't leaders, they're followers. And in fact, one of my favorite stories that Ron told me was there was a vote when Ron was on the education committee, and another very conservative member of the committee voted the wrong way. And this member was a subcommittee chairman, and he went up to Ron went up to him and said, we talked about this. You understand the problems with this bill, and I know you agree with me on the Department of Education. How could you vote with this? And the guy looked at Ron and said, Ron, you don't understand. I can't vote my conscience all the time like you can because I'm in leadership. And when Ron told me that story, we both kind of laughed. And I said, well, sir, you should have gotten a dictionary and looked up and showed him the definition of the word leadership. Because it seems like what he was actually in was followership.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with a lot of people in Washington who think they're leaders. They're actually what the great Dusty Rhodes called walk-behinders. And if you're a walk-behinder, the view never changes. And I just made Jack Hunter's day by throwing in a quote from Dusty Rhodes into this interview.
Yeah. Dusty Rhodes, it's interesting because obviously I don't, consider what Dusty Rhodes did as sport. But I think sports is one of the few places in this.
Don't let Glenn Jacobs hear you say that.
Yeah, but I think sports is actually one of the few places in this world where you do see actual leadership, and you see how positive leadership can be. Whether it be Nick Saban or Vince Lombardi or just some really great high school football coach, because leadership is motivating people to focus on a goal and get the job done, and you see that in sports.
Right, but you don't see right, and you probably see that in some businesses. You probably see that and I know that certainly for all the problems we might have with them, I do think people like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg have shown a lot of leadership and a lot of I think it took a lot of, I think it did take a certain amount of courage for Bezos. People forget this now, but there was a time in the 90s when Amazon was literally him sitting at a desk in a warehouse full of books, the little homemade sign over his desk that said Amazon.com. And nobody knew who he was. And at the time, the idea of even buying a book over the internet was just kind of bizarre. And at the time, had they wanted to, or had they had the foresight to see the potential of the internet, Borders could have crushed him. They didn't. Barnes and Noble tried eventually, and I think they were just too late to the party. But there's leadership still in the private sector. Leadership in DC, again, it's mostly followership. It's mostly pandering. It's mostly going along with whatever the party tells you is the votes. And it's one of the things about that made people would say, well, you guys have the easiest job in Washington. Well, in terms of knowing how our boss would vote and not having to play this game of like, well, we voted this way last week to please this group, and now you should probably vote against leadership a couple of times because you're going to get attacked. It was always just, what is the principle here? But it also meant that we had to do our own work, our own thinking, and we had to figure out what was wrong with it on a principled basis, but also what would the average voter in Texas understand, what would the average person around the country understand as to why it would vote. And just saying it was unconstitutional was an important argument to make, but it had to be the first argument and not the final argument, because a lot of people will say, well, are you saying that every other member of Congress votes regularly against the Constitution? We say, yes, we are. And but it's also because on a practical level, this is what it's bad. And we had to look very carefully for those details. The one time saver trick that we learned very quickly was look at the title of the legislation and then think of the exact opposite. It's almost like the George Costanza rule. Think of the exact opposite of what it will do. And you can see that look at some of the big legislation we saw in the time that Ron was up there, the Patriot Act. I think if you asked Jefferson or Madison if the Patriot Act was patriotic, they would say, well, yeah, if you oppose it, then you're being a true patriot. The Affordable and Accessible Quality Care Act, which is the official name of what became known as Obamacare. So it was going to lower healthcare costs and make healthcare better for everybody. How exactly did that work out for us?
Yeah, I know.
That's there's I'm sure other examples. What are they called? Something like gun-free zones. Safe and Gun-Free Schools Act, I think, was the title of the bill that created the the rule that you couldn't have a firearm within so many feet of a school. So since that law was passed, we haven't had any mass shootings in any government or private school, have we?
Yeah, I know it's So,
and I don't mean to make light about a tragedy, but actually that is a tragedy. That the fact that schools are disarmed is a tragedy, and the fact that other than Thomas Massey of Kentucky, who is certainly in the House the closest thing we have to another Ron, is I don't see anybody on our side of the gun debate who's willing to stand up and say, no, we're not just going to offer thoughts and prayers. We offer real solutions, and we've tried your solutions, and your solutions suck. Because guess what? Criminals and psychopaths don't follow gun control laws. No, there's never been I guarantee you, no one has ever driven to a school with the intention of carrying out a shooting and saw the gun-free school sign and said, oh, I didn't realize I wasn't allowed to carry a gun onto this school, and turned around and gone home.
Yeah, sometimes when something like this happens, I just go out on social media and say something like, this couldn't have happened. Guns are illegal in Germany, or something like that, and just say, it's, and I don't understand this. I'm really trying to figure out this mentality of you make something illegal, somebody does it, so then you want to make something else illegal. And where do you stop with that? But that's a stale topic. The one thing is, I feel like the anti-gunners have just gotten so frustrated, and I think there's enough people fighting the good fights out there that it's kind of become a moot point, which I'm kind of glad to see, because it didn't seem that way 30 years ago. But maybe they just finally realized there's no practical way to make this work, because we're not going to be able to take away all these guns. But anyway, Norman, obviously Massey and there are a few other people in Congress that are close to Massey. I mean, I used to live in Chip Roy's district, and I often said he was the first representative I had who didn't completely embarrass me. But do you think it's possible to get to a point where we have 20 Thomas Masseys and 20 Justin Amashes, or is it like I said, is it just always going to be a fluke when we get one?
It depends again on how we're able to grow the liberty movement, and what success we have in, first of all, recruiting good candidates, and candidates who are able to stand up to the leadership. And that would require some independence. And one of the things about Thomas Massey and both the elder and younger Dr. Pauls is that they all are able to go back to a private sector career, and pick it up. And some members don't have that. Some members, too, they like DC. I think it was the conservative author Stan Evans who made the observation that one of the problems is that a lot of our people come to DC thinking that it's a swamp, and after they're there for a while, they decide it's a hot tub.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And
Fight of the crocodiles.
yeah, they get seduced into DC, and also they get seduced by the idea of, well, you shouldn't vote for Ron Paul because Ron Paul because he's been totally ineffective, and they define ineffective as voting for bad legislation because you cut a deal with the leadership to make it a little bit less bad. In fact, it's another one of my favorite stories. There was a conservative, good conservative. I'm not going to name his name, but representative from Arizona, who was in the leadership of the largest conservative organization on Capitol Hill with the Republican Study Committee, and one day and Ron was a member of them for a while, a couple of terms. He left because he was frustrated that they were always like saying, we're all going to vote for this bill because Gingrich and Army agreed to cut 2% off of what they're spending, so it's only going to be a 4% increase instead of a 6% increase in spending, and or they dropped these 5 horrible provisions, which for all we knew they might have been put in there by leadership in the first place, thinking that we'll drop this if conservatives squeal about it, so we can let them save some face by saying that we stopped these horrible provisions that were in there, so we could stop them and let's pretend that we actually accomplished something. And that just, that was, Ron was never willing to see the principle. But anyway, this representative was talking to his staff about whatever offer the leadership had made back to see if if he would support it and if other conservatives would support it. And finally, after going round and round about what counteroffer they would make to leadership, the gentleman said, I'm just going to start voting like Ron Paul and just say no to everything that is unconstitutional or violates my principles, because I think Ron is right. We're not getting anywhere just cutting these small deals with leadership and then voting for all their crap.
Yeah. Well, Norman, one thing I guess I mean when I ask this is I don't think America really does want a Congress full of Thomas Masseys or a Congress full of Justin Amashes. And so, a case in point, last year was the primary for governor here in Texas. And Ron Paul endorsed a guy named Don Huffines, who was running for governor in the primary. And Huffines, I don't agree with Huffines on everybody, but he was I think the best of that lot. There was also a guy named Chad Prather who didn't seem too bad, and both of them were very critical of Greg Abbott for what he did in 2020. And a lot of governors in 2020 cemented their status as the worst governors in the history of their states. I mean, Greg Abbott, because of 2020, is the worst governor in the history of Texas. But guess what? The Ron Paul endorsed candidate gets less than 12% of the vote in the primary, and Greg Abbott gets 66. So again, how does Ron Paul get elected in a party where the voters clearly would rather have Greg Abbott and Mitch McConnell?
You need to change minds. You need to change hearts. And you also need to be prepared. I think it was Friedman who said that. I know one of the quotes is from Milton Friedman, which is that our goal is not to elect enough good people in Congress to have a majority, because we'll never be able to accomplish that. Our goal is to control the political climate in which the politicians operate in, so that even the bad people vote with us, because they don't believe in anything. And so they could vote for Ron Paul, they could vote with the congressional leadership, or they could vote for Bernie Sanders. It doesn't matter, as long as their votes make enough people back home happy that they'll win re-election. And even there, a lot of it depends on endorsements, because you can have your local farm bureau send out a little letter to every one of their members who lives in Ron's district, saying your member voted this way or voted wrong or right, and that might influence their votes.
Yeah.
And I think the other great quote from, and I want to say it was Friedman who said this, was that in a time of a crisis, which is where major change tends to happen, the politicians respond by grabbing the first idea that's on the shelf. So therefore, our job is to be the first idea on the shelves. And the two kind of go together. And so that's why, I emphasize, having learned it from Dr. Paul and other great thinkers in our movement, that we need to change the intellectual climate, the political climate. We need to have a movement that is focused on pushing the politicians in our direction. And the Ron Pauls will emerge out of that and thrive out of that melee. I mean, we see it even now, though, with the Freedom Caucus wanting to work, starting. I just saw this morning that there are actually Freedom Caucus members who are going to be working with progressives on repealing the authorizations of forces against Iraq and the authorization against Afghanistan from 2001, 2002. And I just thinking about those open-ended authorizations have been used to justify so much mischief, including some government surveillance. And they were passed under the Republican president, and then the Democratic president kind of cemented them into stone because Obama used them to justify a lot of the things he did, and Trump used them to justify a lot of things he did. And now there's a bipartisan effort to do that. We see that with Ukraine, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene are kind of beating the drums against the Ukraine war. And she's being criticized by a lot of so-called progressives who, because it's a Democrat in the White House and because it's a Democrat cheerleading for the war, that's Nancy Pelosi, they say that, well, this war must be okay because this must be our war. And that's something we need to really, that's an attitude we need to get rid of and challenge, is partisanship, especially when it comes to an issue as bad as foreign policy. We also need to focus on the Federal Reserve. I believe the Fed is the root cause of most of our problems, including the warfare state, because the cost of having a warfare state would be unbearable if you didn't have the fiat money system and the monetization of debt that allowed the government to run up these huge debts and build up this two-tier economic system that we have.
Yeah, it's one note where I know this isn't your area of expertise, but the intellectual climate is absolutely destroyed in this country, and that's been done by the colleges. But I mean, as far as the political climate, one thing we did point, I do know that when Ron Paul ran for Congress back in '96, he did have one big celebrity endorsement, and that was Nolan Ryan at the time, who still, and who knows, if Nolan Ryan tried to run for governor of Texas today, he might still very win easily. I mean, he's very much a hero in Texas. So having somebody like that behind your campaign certainly helps. And certainly once you're in Congress, it's a lot easier to get elected again. The first election is always the toughest, but it really seems to me, though, as much as there, a lot of people have seen what Ron Paul offers, and they just say, no, I don't want that.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and I think it's a mistake that we make.
Yeah.
And I've heard Carol Ann, I'm sure a lot of your viewers know who I'm talking about. The pink lady,
Karen Ann Harlos.
Yes. I just call her the
She's a
pink lady.
firebrand. Yep.
Yeah, but she said this too. She said one of the mistakes we make is assuming that everybody wants liberty. Well, not everybody wants liberty. There are a lot of people, and I'm going to throw in a pop culture reference here. Popular among men at least of my age. There are a lot of people who listen to 2112 and they think that the priests of the temple are actually the good guys because they're providing for everybody. And why would you be a malcontent and want to stir up trouble with your guitar? Or to go back to the original source material, would read Anthem and would say that, yeah, those guys they had it pretty good. They didn't have a lot of modern technology, but they had everything provided. They had their material needs taken care of. Why wouldn't you want that? Why would John Galt want to have everybody disappear and not help build this great welfare state? People like security, and we've been conditioned. Our educational institutions, our media, our culture conditions them. And I agree with the late Andrew Breitbart that culture is upstream from politics, and that what we receive from the media, what we receive from Hollywood, what we receive from the universities, and what our children are force-fed in the government schools does ultimately shape voting patterns. And that's why, look at the debate over the debt ceiling, for example. You want to talk about a phony debate. Republicans are talking about, we want real cuts and we're going to cut spending and blah, 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 blah. And then what's the first thing they do? Well, defense is off the table because Putin. And then we're going to do entitlement reform. And then the Democrats say, oh, you're going to cut Social Security and Medicare. Oh, no. Entitlement reform is off the table. And look, I sympathize, understand, and actually kind of agree with the idea that we're not going to pull the rug off of current beneficiaries or people in their 50s whose entire retirement planning has been structured around the idea that I'm going to get so much in Social Security and I'm going to have so many of my healthcare bills paid for by Medicare that and now it's just not feasible for them to have another option. But why not start looking for young people? And why not start seeing if you can give them a better deal? Dr. Paul suggested that we, if it's not politically feasible to entirely phase out Social Security and Medicare, at the very least, get to a point where you can offer people under 25 the option of saying, I will opt out of Social Security and Medicare. I will not have payroll taxes deducted from my paycheck. But when I turn 65, I will not enroll in the programs, and I will not receive a government check. I will have between now and when time I retire to make my own provisions. And of course, the Republicans, they cave on that. I saw an ad that Donald Trump, I don't know, I think it might be a Trump-aligned super PAC, and I'm not sure the details of the campaign finance law regarding, what relationships Trump can have with a super PAC now. But they were going after DeSantis on cutting Social Security and Medicare. This is a Republican primary, and he even the ad even invoked the pushing grandma over in her wheelchair over the cliff. That was, if you remember this, that it was used against Paul Ryan's very lukewarm budget that still expanded entitlement spending. It's just that it made some reforms that might have made it a little bit more difficult for some people to get some benefits that they technically weren't entitled to under the law anyway, and also trimmed a little bit of slowing the rate of growth too. So you have that entitlement state. You have the special interests of the military industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industrial complex. You have the big farmers who will be down there banging the drums this year for all the farm state subsidies. And you look at the good conservative Republicans who will then line up to vote to give money to big agriculture. And everybody has their hand out. And the only thing is that the system is unsustainable. The crisis will come, the crash will come unless we can somehow reverse course. The Federal Reserve is going to be called upon to do more and more printing, to monetize more and more debt, to stealthily cut federal benefits via inflation, so that your dollar is worth less, so that Social Security check that grandma is getting buys less and less and less and less and less and less and less every year, even with the cost of living adjustment. And we're in for real trouble again unless we reverse course. And the only way, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, Google it, Zoomers, if you don't get that reference, is to make sure that our ideas are the ones on the shelf, closest on the shelf, for the politicians to grab when the crisis comes, and when the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency. And because there's only going to be two options: either find a path back to liberty, or just continue down that slippery slope till we're at total totalitarianism. And the only good part about the second part is seeing the shocked expression on the faces of those who believe that Donald Trump is an insipid dictator and an existential threat to our democracy, when they see what a real dictatorship looks like.
Yeah. I was thinking, do you see any similarities between these charges against Trump and, say, since I live in Austin, the first thing that came to my mind was when Ronnie Earl prosecuted Tom DeLay.
Well, I think it's a political persecution. I think political prosecutions have gone on.
Yeah.
Karl Rove apparently masterminded a prosecution against a Republican representative because he wanted him out. I think because he voted against, was challenging the Bush administration on a few things. When I was a freshman, my liberal criminal procedure professor in 1988 or 89, and when I was a first-year law student, commented that, and I was kind of shocked to hear him say this, commented that he did not approve of the putting Oliver North on trial, because he said you shouldn't use criminal justice to settle political and policy disputes. But that's what's been going on since then, and you will see it being turned against the Democrats when there's a Republican president. I mean, they're already talking about that. And Hunter Biden, when he left his laptop, when he forgot to pick up his laptop, he handed the Republicans the smoking crack pipe that they can use to go after his dad if they and him himself. There is this weaponization, and we've seen two presidents impeached in recent years after going over or almost around 200 years with only two presidents impeached. Now we've had three impeachments since I went to work for Congressman Paul back in 1997. One Clinton and two Trumps, and and again we have talk of Republicans wanting to in the House still wanting to impeach Biden, even though they know it's DOA in the Senate. This type of weaponization of politics, weaponization of law against your political opponents. It happens at the state and local level. I know one very solid, very upfront political consultant who is also not stupid enough to violate the campaign laws, because he knows that when you're a conservative in some parts of even a state like Virginia, even a formerly red, now purple state like Virginia, you can be walking with a target on your back, because the left and the Democrat establishment are out to get you, and the Republican establishment and the so-called conservative establishment will not lift a finger to help you. they'll just say, "Oh, isn't that a shame what it's doing to our candidate?" But we've had no choice but to replace the right winger that was beloved by the grassroots with Mr. Establishment Milquetoast. That's beloved by the establishment.
Yeah, and from what I hear, campaign finance laws, it's almost impossible to navigate. It's like a minefield to try to navigate it. But I haven't really worked on a campaign. But Norman, one thing I got to ask you, since you worked for Ron Paul, who all did you work with in the office, and who were some really good people, who were some not so good people?
Well, I think everybody was good. One person that you might recognize from Texas politics that was the press secretary at first was Michael Quinn Sullivan.
I know who that is. Yes.
Yeah. Good guy. And he was a great help in the early days. He came on. He actually came because he was writing for the local paper in Lake Jackson, and he wrote a column called something like "A Conservative Case Against the Drug War." And Ron read it and was very impressed. So he called Michael and they met. And then Ron was impressed with Michael and said, "I'm thinking of running for Congress. Would you be interested in coming and doing communications for me?" And Michael came to D.C. for a few years and then went back and is, as I understand it, is causing good trouble up in Austin for years, which is great. J. Bradley Jansen, a guy who did really smart guy who did financial services for a couple of years, helped really build some good left-right coalitions against a lot of surveillance stuff in the years before 9/11. When it was a much easier time to fight the surveillance state, and because it was Clinton, it was a lot easier to get Republicans lined up on the side of civil liberties, including, ironically, John Ashcroft. And I worked with Ashcroft's people on opposing a national ID card that was actually proposed by Lamar Smith back then. And our first LD, legislative director, my predecessor, Joe Becker, great guy, really smart guy, studied under Rothbard and Hoppe at the University of Nevada, a law degree. And right now he is setting up a full-time PhD program down in Auburn at Mises. And then after Michael left, we had Jeff Deist come in. His first stint was as press secretary for Ron. Jeff, can't say enough good things about Jeff. He's a great guy, smart guy. I'm sorry to see him leave the Mises Institute, because I think he's done a really great job there and doing an almost impossible job, because Lou Rockwell is so identified with that as the founder, the president, and the guy who got things started. And Lou's just done such tremendous work. And he was a big help to all of us on the staff. Our first office manager, Rebecca Tyrrell, who now works for the JBS and writes for the New American. So she's still involved in the movement.
Is Rebecca Tyrrell related to R. Emmett Tyrrell by chance?
I don't think so. I don't believe, she never mentioned it. She might have been embarrassed to bring it up. And then after Joe left, we brought on Daniel McAdams and Adam Dick, who I'm sure a lot of people here recognize those names from the Ron Paul Institute, and they recognize the name Daniel McAdams from the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Daniel's a really smart guy who had a great background in foreign policy. And I remember Daniel actually started shortly after 9/11. And I remember we were standing in line waiting to get in after the anthrax scare of 2001. And Daniel had been on the job maybe like less than a full week before that started. And we were just chatting, and I didn't really know much about him at all, but I made a comment about, these Hill staffers, they actually love this inconvenience for so-called security, because it feeds their need to be self-important and think that they're vital to the country. And Daniel kind of rolled his eyes and goes, "Yeah, bunch of scumbags." And I thought, I like this guy. I think I'm going to like working with him.
Yeah. Yeah, there were some other people too, though, like I think there was Eric Dondero, Jesse Benton. Some of those people came in, I guess.
Yeah. Eric Rickberg.
Yeah, Eric Rydberg. Yeah,
that's his name that I knew him as, and I guess Dondero was Rydberg is the name of his adopted parents apparently, and he when he was working in 90 for Ron in 95 in the campaign, he took some time to find his birth family, and Dondero is I believe a derivation of his birth parents' name or his birth mother's name or something like that. I always liked it. I liked Eric. I used to stay with him when I went to Texas for the first few years.
Yeah.
Sorry, he had a falling out with Ron.
Well,
he was always a little more of a hawk than
yeah.
Ron and the rest of us were. And the one thing he kind of also distorted the discussions we had in the office after 9/11, because it wasn't. Ron always favored some kind of response to 9/11, and Ron did vote for the authorization of military force after we read it, and we just thought we felt comfortable with it. And Eric's claim that Ron had to voted for it solely for political reasons. Well, first of all, that's not Ron. Secondly, and people forget this when they criticize Ron or they criticize that vote, it didn't authorize a military intervention in Afghanistan. It didn't directly authorize that. It didn't authorize a buy your leave, do whatever you want 20 years later if you want to invade countries that had nothing to do with 9/11. It's very, very specifically drawn, and it specifically says related to the attacks of September 11th. So here, 12 years after our forces killed Osama bin Laden, the fact that that's still being relied on by the president, and I don't blame the Congress that voted for that. I blame the subsequent Congresses, and I think Ron and a few others who voted for the resolution, like Dennis Kucinich, and then others who saw the light afterwards, like particularly the late Walter Jones, did their job in trying to hold the president accountable for abusing that authority limited authority that was granted to him. But most of Congress just overlooked it completely, and it really is a disgusting display by Congress. And Iraq is even worse because Ron actually introduced tried to get a vote on a real declaration of war and was denied that on the floor of the House. I think he got one in committee, and that's when the chairman of the committee, Henry Hyde, who was supposed to be a great expert on the Constitution, declared that the provision of declaration of the Constitution was anachronistic. Well, I've read the Constitution several times. I don't know what Constitution Henry Hyde was reading, but I didn't see anything in there that said that any provision can be overlooked if Congress determines that it's just an anachronism.
Well, it's kind of like, when Nancy Pelosi said, "You're kidding, right?" When somebody asked her, "Is this consistent with the Constitution?" She just said, "You're kidding, right?" I mean, strictly speaking, the Constitution is an anachronism. I mean, they don't care one iota what it says, but for that matter, yeah. I mean, but I definitely.
But Donald Trump paying some porn star that he had relations with is an existential threat to our system of government and the rule of law.
Yeah, not all. Yeah, don't get mad about the other things he did, but and somebody made the comparison. I said this is the equivalent of prosecuting Trump for not returning a library book 10 years ago.
Well, and why isn't there more looks into how the FDIC can all of a sudden just say, and Biden and the Fed and the Treasury can just say, we're going to cover everyone's deposit 100%, even though Congress, the law clearly says you only get up to $250,000. And when I think about that $250,000 in savings, anyone who doubts that this is a bailout for the rich, ask yourselves: do you have $250,000 in your savings account?
Oh yeah.
Do you know anybody in the middle class who has $250,000 in savings in
Oh,
your
yeah.
savings account at your bank.
Oh,
If
yeah.
you do, God bless you for having that kind of money, but you're also kind of an idiot at the rate the interest rates have been for the
Oh,
past
yeah.
few years.
Yeah.
So
Certainly.
this is clearly a bailout for the rich. Why aren't we looking into that?
Oh, yeah.
Why aren't we looking into Trump's the way Trump went along with the lockdowns? Why aren't we discussing that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Why aren't we discussing why aren't we having the more discussions about mass surveillance and the Twitter files?
Yeah.
Everybody wants to go back before. This is something that we at the Market Institute like to use the phrase. It's time to separate tech. We need the separation of tech and state. Why don't we do more about the Twitter files? Why aren't we having more subpoenas of Biden administration officials to come up and say, do you not understand? Did it ever occur to you that maybe I'm violating the First Amendment by using my position as a government official to tell Twitter and Facebook, hey, we don't like what these people are saying. Please deplatform them, or at the very least, remove all their posts that question the COVID vaccine or the Ukrainian narrative, or bring up Hunter Biden's laptop from hell, or anything else, or the stolen election, anything else. And by the way, that reminds you asked about interesting people I worked with in the Ron Paul office. Here's something, and this, by the way, is something that shows, I think, says something about the media. Stuart Rhodes, who's a lot of your audience will probably recognize as the founder of Oath Keepers, who was recently convicted for his involvement in January 6th, which we know was the worst day in history, maybe second to 9/11. But certainly the worst day in since then.
As far as the left's concerned, it was worse. But
yeah.
It was worse than November 22nd, 63. It was worse than December 7th, 41. Yeah.
Yes. But Stuart and what the media will never tell you, and I know this because of my friendship and association with him. When his trial was in the news, I tried to read everything I could about him, and also to see what they said about Ron, which was downplayed. It was downplayed, and also was downplayed was that he went to, I think, Yale Law School after he left Ron's office in 99 or 2000, and he won a writing prize for a paper criticizing the Bush administration's civil liberties policies. Now, that's going to be news to a lot of people because that's not mentioned in any of the profiles about him. And the reason it is you see how our media operates. They had a predetermined narrative, which was that Stewart was a right-wing Trump supporter, authoritarian, rabid partisan. Oh, if he was criticizing George Bush and the Patriot Act back in 2005, 2004, 2005, for an Ivy League, as part of a paper written for an Ivy League law school that was so good it won a writing prize, that kind of screws up that predetermined narrative, doesn't it? So we'll just sweep that under the memory hole.
Yeah, they definitely. Yeah, it's like we'll figure out some way to nail this guy, and then we'll look for evidence. Norman, since you you mentioned McAdams. Where was McAdams before he went to work for Ron Paul?
He actually was an election observer in Hungary, I think, and he worked for some DC organizations, and he's told his story a number of times. It's interesting that in the 90s, the intervention in Serbia and the Balkans was the big foreign policy event, and he actually had a lot of conservative opposition to it, but that's how Daniel discovered Ron, was through looking for sources in the American sources that were telling the truth about what was really going on over there, and not this childish narrative we always get of what Rothbard used to call the Hitler of the week. was Slobodan Milosevic at the time.
The Hitler of the week,
So
yes.
he discovered antiwar.com and Justin Raimondo. And through that, he discovered LewRockwell.com. And through those sources, he discovered Ron. And then when Joe left and Ron was finally on the International Relations Committee, somebody that had been working, I think it was a guy named Jim Jaffords, who as a former Senate staffer, who was very much involved in Balkans War activities and knew Daniel from that, told Daniel that there was an opening in Ron Paul's office. And so he applied, Daniel applied and got the job, and the rest is history.
Yeah. What do you think happens to, obviously Ron Paul is getting up there and he's still, sounds pretty good, but, if Ron Paul, what happens to, the Ron Paul Institute and some of these organizations once Ron Paul is, gone?
I try not to think about that.
Yeah.
But, I think that Daniel will be able to carry that legacy forward. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of having a Ron Paul Institute, is something that can continue to keep Ron's keep Ron ideas advancing, legacy going. And I think Daniel's done a tremendous job in just 10 years this month with the Institute. They're growing. They have great conferences. They're having one in Houston. I would encourage everybody who can to go to it. They have a conference in Dulles, right outside of DC, every year. I would encourage everybody to go to that if you can. Wonderful conferences. They do a lot of work with the Mises Institute, which of course is an important part of Ron's legacy too, because I think what a lot of people don't know is that Lou was not just Ron's former chief of staff, and when he left Ron's official office, their friendship and partnership didn't end there. In fact, Ron played a key role in the Mises Institute, because the first fundraising letter that the Mises Institute sent out was signed by Ron, and Ron allowed his list to be used to help raise the money to get Mises off the ground.
Yeah.
That will continue going on. Young Americans for Liberty, I know they've had some issues with some of their leadership, but from what I've seen and heard, they seem to be doing very well. And I know I met their new president. I guess she might not be the new president anymore, but the president who succeeded the former president. And one of the things that she stressed to me was that she wants them to make sure that they continue to build on and honor Ron's legacy, because that was that's how the group got started.
It was Students for Ron Paul. Yeah.
Right. And I think that and then we have, still have pockets of Ron Paul Republicans. You have our friends at the Mises Caucus. Michael Heiss has done an incredible job in terms of mobilizing and bringing in a lot of enthusiasm and fresh ideas and a great new approach to the LP. And it's one that I just say that I think that it's something I've actually been waiting for since 2008. I thought that after the debacle of the Republican convention in 2012, that Gary Johnson should have recorded a video or gotten someone to record a video endorsing him, saying that I'm Norm Singleton. I'm a Ron Paul Republican. I supported Ron in the primaries. But as a Ron Paul Republican, I'm going to vote for Gary Johnson.
Yeah. Because most Ron Paul people back then were pretty positive about Gary Johnson. I mean, I've always said though, back in 2012, that Senate seat in New Mexico was wide open. Gary Johnson possibly could have run for that and possibly could have gotten and very well could have gotten it. So we could have, instead of having Gary Johnson run for president and get 1% of the vote, we could have had we might have had Gary Johnson in the Senate.
Yeah, that
was a wasted opportunity.
That would have been wonderful. I mean, I think he would have made a great senator, especially today when he would be up there with Rand. And I guess he would have been up there with Rand in 2012, but he'd be there with Rand and Mike Lee and I almost said Ted Cruz, but Senator Cruz is not what we thought he was back in
He's been disappointing, but he's still not horrible, but he's been disappointing. Yeah, there's been a few, and that's the thing. He's still better than most of them in the Senate by far, but it's kind of as far as what another thing that Ron Paul inspired too, though, is I think he's very much an influence on the entire cryptocurrency sphere. I think that might be his most lasting impression, really, because that's one movement that I think does have the potential to change things.
Yeah, I have to.
I mean, he gets invited to cryptocurrency events to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I know a couple of the when I met them, they were younger people who got very involved in cryptocurrency, and their interest in this was spurred by Ron's campaign. I mean, as Tom Woods likes to say, when was the last time when did you ever hear somebody say, well, Mitt Romney changed my worldview? I was inspired to study these ideas by Mitt Romney. I mean, one of the things that, one of the great things about Ron is that, he kind of has this in common. Actually, it's just occurred to me. What do Ron Paul and J.K. Rowling have in common?
They reached the same age bracket. I don't know.
They both got young people to read books.
Okay, I'll give you that. Yeah.
I remember because I remember some talk show host was talking about the criticism that some conservatives, social conservatives, particularly last at Harry Potter for promoting occultism, and they said, well, there's stories, and they said you'd think that though that I'm sorry, I have to plug in my PC because I just got the battery low warning. Would be thrilled with Harry Potter because when was the last time you were at a bookstore and you saw a 13-year-old or younger running out of the store enthusiastically screaming, I got the book. And Ron had that same effect. Now, Ron's effect, I think, was a little better, more positive for society and certainly for human liberty, because instead of Harry Potter, it was Mises and Rothbard and Hayek and Ron's work himself and Tom Woods and the other great scholars of the Austrian school and historians. Ron does that show every day, and he's inspired, people like you who do, podcasts and just all these great things that we're doing to spread the ideas of liberty. And then you have these wonderful, at least two really good representatives, and then some other good ones. You mentioned Chip Roy. I'd say that I was really impressed with Chip Roy's role in the speaker debate.
Yeah,
because unlike some other members of Congress, he took the very strategic view, which was that I'm not just going to stomp my feet and say I don't like Kevin McCarthy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take is I'm going to leverage this position, and I'm going to say to McCarthy and the rest of the GOP leadership, I will vote for you eventually. But first, this is what I want, and I'm giving it to you now. You come back to me with a counteroffer, and we'll discuss things, and we'll leave here with making everybody happy. And I think Kevin McCarthy actually is going to owe Chip Roy a big debt of gratitude, because that, I think, really helped push McCarthy over the finish line to get those votes. But it also is making him a more effective speaker, because he has a more unified Republican caucus because of that, and a caucus that is going to be able to accomplish more in terms of investigations, accountability, setting up things for 2024. Because honestly, there's just not going to be a whole lot of legislation except what absolutely has to be passed here. And there's going to be some kind of debt ceiling increase. Unfortunately, I say that because as someone who agrees with Dr. Paul, that people say it's irresponsible to not raise the debt ceiling. So if I max out on my credit card and I ask Visa to, what's my credit limit, please? Because I'm having trouble because I maxed out my card.
Exactly.
So we're not going to do that. Can I tell Visa that you're being irresponsible because you're forcing me to default on those debts? Yeah. And this is dangerous and bad. Yeah. Don't you understand that?
Yeah.
So apply the Bastiat principle here, that to finance, that the government can't get away with what individuals can get away with. Why I can't get away with having an unlimited line of credit at Visa that I never pay back? Why should the government be able to do that?
Norman, I should ask you this sooner. Did Dr. Paul or did you or anybody else have any interactions with, as I call him, Robert Stadler Greenspan? Alan Greenspan, that is.
Ron had a lot of run-ins with Greenspan when he was first up there, because it was Greenspan's, the last part of Greenspan's tenure coincided with I think it was from 97 to 94. So with Ron's first couple of terms in Congress. And,
Greenspan was the Federal Reserve chair for a long time.
87 to like 2004, 2005,
2006.
2006. Wow. So, so he really he got on the lifeboat just before the Titanic hit the iceberg then.
Yeah. It's interesting, the timing of Greenspan. I asked that largely because this is a crude way to put it, but Alan Greenspan is what I call an Ayn Rand masturbator. He reads Ayn Rand. He says he likes Ayn Rand, but then he doesn't do anything with it. And I would also apply that. I'd probably apply that to Paul Ryan, and I would also apply that to Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban's not in the government.
Mark Cuban is actually doing more to help make the world a better place on Shark Tank than either Paul Ryan or Alan Greenspan ever did in politics.
Well, I was just, I thought if anybody was going to speak out, if any of the billionaires were going to speak out against this COVID nonsense, it might have been Mark Cuban. He just went along with it.
I think, Greenspan, there was a meet and greet where members could get a picture with Greenspan or something like that before one of the monetary hearings, and Ron had dug out his old copy of the Objectivist newsletter that had Greenspan's great article on the gold standard, and he asked Greenspan to sign it for him, and and Ron said, "Would you mind signing this, unless you think it'll get you into trouble?" And Greenspan kind of chuckled, and he said, "No." He said, I actually just happened to reread this article a couple of weeks ago, and I still agree with everything in it." And so Ron asked him about the gold standard at a hearing a couple years after that. And Greenspan's explanation for to square that circle was that, yes, the gold standard is superior or was superior at one point, but central bankers have figured out how to manage a fiat currency that it mimics the best possible scenario of the gold standard. Now, as Adam Dick pointed out in a conversation that we had about this, even if that was true, the time that it took for central bankers to figure it out imposed a lot of suffering on people. So it really still doesn't justify central banking.
Yeah.
It just makes it less bad.
Yeah.
Because if all you're going to do is, screw up the economy for a few years till you figure out to do just as well as the old system did, you should have just stuck with the old system.
This goes back to what when I was talking about Bitcoiners earlier, though, Norman. I think among Bitcoiners, there's an attitude, and I certainly believe this, that you can't have capitalism and have democracy. You can't have a gold standard and have democracy.
We're not supposed to be a democracy. We're supposed to be a republic.
Every republic becomes a democracy.
And
every republic becomes a democracy.
Yeah, that's the decline. I was Plato's the decline from republic to pure democracy to totalitarianism. And I remember hearing a political philosopher and writer speak shortly after Bush was elected in 2004, and Bush talked about his mandate, and this said that the concept of the president having a mandate from the people would be met with disapproval by the drafters of the Constitution, because they didn't want a strong executive. They didn't want an executive who claimed the mantle of being of the will of the people. So that's not what a limited republic that respects the rights of the citizens and is a free and is conceived in liberty and protects liberty is supposed to be. And of course, that system is one that's undergirded by central banking. And the idea that we're a mass democracy, and we have a democratic part to it, but right now the democracy has become something that does threaten liberty rather than support it, which is what it was supposed to do.
Yeah, well, that's the whole point of Bitcoin, is you basically create an economic and financial system that cannot be destroyed by voting or by the government in any way.
Right.
Maybe it's not going to work either, but I think it's the best hope we have right now, and that's what probably really maybe the area where I think Ron Paul's had the biggest impact, because outside of the libertarian movement, were there any? Yeah, I'm curious, if you were in Ron Paul's office, were there any books on his shelf that surprised you, or any books in his library that surprised you, or any books that you wish had been there that weren't there?
No, I do think though a lot of his hardcore Austrian supporters might have been surprised that there was in addition to pictures of Rothbard, Hazlitt, and Mises, there was also an autographed picture from Milton Friedman.
Oh, yeah.
Friedman was actually an early endorser of Ron's back in '95. He sent Ron a very nice letter. And interestingly enough, the other big name that endorsed Ron in the Republican primary against the wishes of Newt Gingrich was Phyllis Schlafly.
Oh yeah, Phyllis, that was a big enough name back then. Yeah, Phyllis Schlafly. Yeah, well, I think Phyllis was always old school though, and I don't think she, and a lot of people aren't going to appreciate, because that's the same thing that happened with Phil Gramm in 1984. Phil Gramm went from blue to red and ran against Ron Paul, when Ron Paul decided to run for the Senate in '84.
Right.
And that was ultimately why he, I think, broke from the Red Gang for a while. And went to the Libertarian Party and ran for president. He was, and apparently Reagan had endorsed Phil Gramm. And if Reagan had endorsed Ron Paul might have very well ended up in the Senate.
Yeah.
Reagan's endorsement had a lot of weight.
That might have been part of it, but I also know that there was a lot of disappointment by Ron and some other conservatives too, that Reagan wasn't the person that they thought he was, that he ended up going along with too much big government.
Reagan was horrible. Yeah. But,
his reputation, even as a tax cutter, Reagan signed a lot of huge.
Oh yeah. I'm not denying that, Norman, but I mean, no president in our lifetime was as popular as Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan was my first political, I don't want to say crush, but kind of first political interest or supporter. Those were good times in the '80s.
And I mean, and the Red Team really has not had a decisive victory for the White House since 1988. I mean, they've won the White House, but it was not decisive.
Well, what was it? Nikki Haley's statistic that she's told is the Republicans have lost the popular vote in 4 out of the last 5 elections.
It's definitely not. It's definitely not looking good for the Red Gang. I don't know if that's good or bad.
Because we've won. Republicans won 2 elections despite their candidates losing the popular vote. Now a lot of that is because of California.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because California is the biggest state, and it's also one of the bluest states, and so you're going to get a ton of votes for the Democrat, and that's going to tilt the scales.
Well, the Electoral College rewards you for having narrow victories and punishes you for having big victories. That's how I put it.
Yeah.
I mean, you're better. If you win, if 2 states have 10 electoral votes and one candidate wins one state 51-49, and the other candidate wins the one state 90-10, they both count the same.
Right.
And in fact, you don't even need to get a majority. I think you get all the electoral votes, no matter how many. Even if you just get all the electoral votes, even if you're the leading vote getter. So you can get all those electoral votes. I think even if you get 30% in a 5-candidate race or something like that, it's where do you what kind of who are some of Ron Paul's best allies in the House? How do you work with Dick? He had some time with Dick Armey, right? Or was Dick Armey in the House at the same time he was for a while, or not?
Armey was majority leader for the first couple of years there, from '97 to 2004, and we got along with Army's from Texas, and DeLay's people were somewhat helpful. I had good relationships with a couple of people on Army staff who were more liberty-minded, and personally, Ron got along with people, even Newt,
Yeah.
Ron got along with Newt fairly well on a personal level. Hastert, I think, was a little hostile to Ron because Hastert was a kind of a hack and not really a very cerebral person.
And I know.
And then in terms of allies, it depended on the issue. On economics and the Federal Reserve, we had people like Walter Jones, Dana Rohrabacher. We worked with his office on some medical marijuana issues and also some anti-corporate welfare issues. In terms of foreign policy, Dennis Kucinich, we were able to cross party lot very easily to work with Kucinich and to work with Bernie Sanders on corporate welfare. Sanders was against things like the IMF, the World Bank, Export-Import Bank, things that benefited the big corporations. Ron, someone once asked Ron, "Well, you're a libertarian and he's a socialist. How can the two of you work together on this bill that cuts corporate welfare?" And Ron said, "Because we both hate fascism."
A lot of people don't understand that libertarianism is actually opposed to corporate welfare. That's really telling, And I do know, although it was before your time, Ron Paul used to say, has always said a lot of nice things about the late Larry McDonald, but who wasn't even on who was, an old Southern Democrat.
Right.
But who was unfortunately killed in the shooting of that Korean airliner. But so do you think, where do you think the Red Gang goes from here, Norman? I mean, it's really kind of in disarray. I don't know if the Bill Kristols and the George Bushes will take over, but Trump or Ron DeSantis or maybe somebody else will throw his hat in there that come out of nowhere. I mean,
well, right now I think. Right now it looks like Trump is, thanks to the New York DA, is stronger than he's been in quite some time in terms of being able to be the front runner for getting the nomination in 2024. We'll have to see how that all plays out. I think that my personal opinion on that is that I don't think I think history should show you can't count Trump out, and that he may be one of the few politicians who can not only survive a criminal indictment but can actually come out stronger, and at least with his base more loyal than they were before that. I don't see in this field, with the possible, anyone who might be able to knock him off that pedestal. Maybe DeSantis, but DeSantis seems to be losing some of his luster. I think, and where the red team goes from here, once Trump is no longer on the political scene, whether it's in 2024 or 2028, there's going to be a huge fight over which way the Republican Party goes from here.
Yeah.
And I think you'll have at least three opposing factions. One, the libertarian / liberty movement, Massey, Rand, and then to a lesser extent the Chip Roys of the Jim Jordan's, even the Freedom Caucus folks, arguing for taking some of Trump's populism, some of Trump's America First foreign policy, skepticism towards foreign interventionism, skepticism towards the idea that we can just order the rest of the world around, and if the world doesn't like it, well, they're the bad guys. They're the problem, not us. Approach to things. So you'll have that side, and then you'll have the populist, the Josh Hawleys, the J.D. Vances, who will be on the side of we don't necessarily want a huge like neoconish Bush era type of hyper interventionism, but on the other hand, we want to protect our interest, our jobs. We don't want free trade. We want managed trade that's managed in our interest. We want a foreign policy that is protects us against the threat of China and anybody else who's going to be our global economic competitor. And then at home, we want to use the power of the state to crush the left before they crush us. We want to even domestically intervene in the economy a lot. We want to tell parents that you can't take your child you can't let your child on social media before they're 16 because we decided we know better than you do.
Yeah.
And then there'll be a group that's kind of the squishy milquetoast, neither fish nor fowl Republicans.
Yeah, you didn't mention what about the Pat Robertson types or the hyper religious types?
It'd be interesting to see because I could see them going. I appreciate you reminding me of that. It seems like they're not as influential.
I don't think they are. A lot. Some people have said that the whole thing with Roe versus Wade is what killed the red wave. If it had not been for that, they would have gotten it. And I have to admit, after COVID, I'm becoming more pragmatic about the issue of abortion. It's like if Gretchen Whitmer or Jacinda Ardern or some of these, or somebody like Pat Schrader wants to have an abortion, why would I ever want to get in her way?
Well, if Michigan wants to, I like Dr. Paul take the states' rights approach to this.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, state authority.
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is that politics is war, and if the enemy is gonna kill their kids, why do you want to stop them?
Well, first we can't guarantee that their kids will grow up to be as destructive as their parents. But
maybe not, but yeah.
I mean, I would.
That's a very cynical way of looking at it, but yes.
I would hope that, and there's something that I think we need to discuss more about is, people like to say Black Lives Matter. Well, what about all the Black lives that are snuffed out in the womb?
Oh yeah,
and have a chance.
I know. Or you could, and you can certainly talk about the civil war in Cameroon or something like that.
But we have to. I think that in terms of the religious right, and it's been that way for a while. They don't seem to have the power in the Republican Party that they had, and a lot of it is they're more or less like a part of the Trump coalition right now.
Yeah.
And I actually do know some Christians, conservative Christians, who they may have voted for Trump, but they're a little disturbed by the way that Christian conservative leaders fell in behind Trump, and they defend him. They defend his character, and they never say anything critical of him when it's, the mote in Trump's eye is so much bigger than the speck in the eye of some liberal Democrat whose worst crime was being too woke. You're talking about a guy who's on his third wife, who may or may not have had an affair with a star of adult movies. not exactly someone I would put as qualified to preach in Sunday sermons. Now, my response to the question of, how can a Christian conservative justify voting for Trump is, just be honest. Say he's flawed, his character is flawed, his past is flawed. I agree with all that. But everyone is flawed. Every human being is flawed. And he is committed to advancing an agenda, a political agenda that I find appealing. In the case of abortion, I find it a moral necessity, and I think that voting for the pro-life candidate, even if they have the moral failings of Donald Trump, is still the moral option, as opposed to the virtue signaling that I get by pretending that by jumping on the Never Trump bandwagon and giving aid and comfort to people whose policy agenda I find morally repellent. And Trump's personal conduct is ultimately between him and God.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that ever since the late 90s and maybe before that, but certainly since the Clinton impeachment of the late 90s, the religious leaders who are involved in politics might have a difficult time making that argument, because a lot of them did make other arguments, or the opposite argument, about the importance of our leaders having good values, when the leader we were talking about was Bill Clinton and his fooling around with Monica Lewinsky.
Yeah. Well, the thing, that got Clinton in trouble wasn't that. It was the fact that he lied under oath, and that's what they went after him for. But, I never asked you this. I should ask you this too, Norman, since it's just happened. What do you think about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Filing the paperwork to run for the Blue Gang and possibly enter that presidential race? I think I know the name Kennedy doesn't quite have the it wasn't quite political gold like it used to be, but still a lot of people certainly know who he is, and they know he was the nephew of the last president who died in office and was assassinated. So how do you think he's going to factor into this? Obviously he's got the name recognition, and he's certainly got the money.
If I was an anti-COVID, anti-war progressive, I would be enthusiastic about Kennedy, especially if on the vaccine front, bringing these issues to the fore, and maybe costing Biden a little bit of support and sending a message to it. I'd be concerned that there are two progressive candidates looking like right now running against Biden, and that they're both going to be marginalized by the media, Marianne Williams and RFK Jr., and that they would both be, and that they would try to come to some kind of understanding, maybe a joint campaign or something, so that they don't split the anti-Biden vote too much. I don't, at this point, still see either of them gaining any real traction, but at least they'll be out there highlighting their issues.
Well,
he's actually spoken before the RPI conference, so he's willing to work in a cross partisan lines. His dad and his uncle were obviously historic figures, and that name is pretty is still, I think, carries some clout in Democratic circles.
Certainly among and the other thing too is, Norman, certainly the older voters, and the older voters are the ones who vote.
Right.
Dennis Kucinich was, I recently heard him talking about, I remember I was in high school when the president was shot. He's going to, if not for family connections, I almost might have thought that RFK would go over to the red side, but I think, I think it's the same reason why why Joe Manchin stays in the blue gang. It's because of family.
Well,
and that does sometimes is sometimes a factor.
Well, Manchin is an interesting case, because he has a reputation now as a great conservative Democrat, but remember he voted for Obamacare. He voted against I don't forget if he voted for the Trump tax cuts or not. I think he voted against them. I know he's been in favor of increasing taxes.
I'm originally from West Virginia, so I know a lot about Joe Manchin, and that's they're actually he was actually coming out of a fairly prominent family in West Virginia. He had an uncle who was Secretary of State, and West Virginia was Jimmy Carter won West Virginia in 1980. I mean, from 1932 to 2014, the Blue Gang held Charleston. That is probably as long a time as any party has held. I mean, that's a very long time for any party to hold a state legislature. 1932 to 2014, they had the majority down in Charleston. So that's part of the reason I think why Joe Manchin is still on the blue side. Jim Justice actually ran blue for governor and then turned red once he got elected, and then he got reelected red.
Well, I think you'll see in 2024. It'll be interesting to see how RFK Jr. does and Marianne Williams does. I hope they don't split the anti-Biden vote, and it's mainly because I'd like to see the Biden administration called to account for their support of this insane COVID spending and the lockdowns and the mandatory vaccines and vaccine passports and masks and all the rest of it. And I'd also like to see a pushback against the warfare state of Biden. Unfortunately, you're also going to get, and if they do well, you're going to get the media narrative is then going to be, well, this proves that the people want Medicare for all, and they want a lot of big government spending that you're not giving them. So pack up your stuff and go home and come back when you're ready to be a serious person. Serious person described as in DC as someone who wants the government to do a whole lot of things. And it reminds me, just came to mind a quip by the late Joe Sobran describing American politics, which is in American politics, if you favor the welfare state but oppose the warfare state, you're a liberal. If you favor the warfare state but oppose the welfare state, you're a conservative. If you oppose both the welfare and the warfare state, you're an extremist. And if you support both the welfare state and the warfare state, you're a moderate.
That's a brilliant observation, and there's a lot of truth to that. I don't think Marianne Williamson is going to compare to a Kennedy running. At least that's my take. I won't be surprised if she drops out because she doesn't get a lot of traction. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see what happens because
the only thing that I saw a podcast yesterday on it was Breaking Points with Crystal Ball and Sager at however you pronounce his last name, and they made the point that Ball made the point that before she became involved in politics, she was a well-known best-selling author. I think she was like associated with Oprah somehow.
Oh,
so
yeah.
A lot of people who are like, well, I really, I really like her.
And anything Oprah endorses, that's the surest sign to run away. I mean,
Including Obama.
Yes. I mean, well, I don't know if Oprah is going to endorse her candidacy, but I know, yeah, that's the first time I remember seeing Marianne Williamson. I mean, she's kind of this. I don't. The interesting thing too about RFK running is he's actually, I see, I don't know how much you paid attention to the overall libertarian movement, but so many libertarians sold out on COVID that I don't even consider them libertarians anymore. And it's going to be interesting because now so many of those same people who used to call themselves libertarians are now they also have a lot of Trump derangement syndrome. So now, so they're thinking about, I mean, I know they say, oh, well, we got to vote for Biden because of this awful Donald Trump. And now it's like, I thought, I think I wouldn't be shocked if some libertarians actually get behind RFK, but they'll be more like the Ron Paul type libertarians and less like the Cato or Reason crowd. I won't be surprised if Cato and Reason start attacking RFK pretty quickly because they've attacked because they were very spineless on COVID and they seem to hate anybody who now is questioning that. Why do they hate Ron DeSantis, for example?
There are some libertarians who are pro-vaccine, not just in terms of their personal opinion is you should have it, but their pro-vaccine mandate in that, that in cases of infectious diseases, that to not get a vaccine and then go out in public and infect somebody else is violating.
Yeah, there's this whole perverse way of they say, well, the right to life. So therefore the right to, my right to life is greater than your right to have a my right to life supersedes your right to have a family reunion, or my right to life supersedes your right to have a big wedding. That kind of nonsense. There was that kind of nonsense too.
Yeah, well, my right to life supersedes your right to have a phone to make a phone call overseas to someone who might be accidentally on the terrorist watch list.
Yeah,
and your right to then go about your business being surveyed by FISA. I mean, you want to play.
Yeah, I know. I know it was complete madness, but I've heard some of these freaks say that. I mean, that's why some of them are. I don't consider them libertarians anymore, but that's. And I'm always skeptical of any libertarian who becomes obsessed with the crimes of one side and yet isn't focusing on the crimes of the other side. That's always a red flag.
Well, you see that on both sides too. I mean, on the other hand, I know libertarians, I know strong Ron Paul supporters who went full in for Trump and just defend everything he did. And about their bad policies, they'll say, yeah, but he's opposed by the deep state and he's and he's owning the left. It's like, okay, that's good, but it doesn't really address the concerns that I'm raising here.
Oh yeah. What's kind of amazing me, Norman, is that I'm definitely much more ideological, and I'm finding out that more and more people it's just really about personalities. And if they like somebody, and if they decide that they like somebody, and that somebody says 2 + 2 = 5, they'll start saying 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah. I mean,
or more often they'll change their tune because they hate somebody, because Ron Paul's not perfect, and Ron Paul has made some mistakes, but you see some of these people who are in the LP and with some of these various organizations who have this Ron Paul derangement syndrome. And I think some of them might have actually said these COVID policies are okay because Ron Paul opposed them. As screwed up as that sounds.
Well, I know that, they're very, and I think I give some people a pass if in like March and April of 2020, they were saying that because nobody knew. But at some point, rather early on, it should have become clear. And
but that was also the most important time to oppose them, Norman.
Yeah, this was overkill.
That was also the most important time to be against these policies. I mean, I don't care if you say you were against slavery in 1870. I really don't care. I care about what you were saying about slavery in 1850.
You just reminded me, one of the most annoying things that I have with some libertarians is
Yeah.
I won't name the person who did it, but he's because he's someone whose work on policy I have a lot of respect for. But they wrote an article called "Libertarians Oppose the Confederacy" or something like that, and it was basically like it was when Tom Woods was being one of the 2-minute hates against Tom Woods. This happened, and he didn't directly mention Tom, but it's pretty clear from the timing and the context that that's what he was talking. That it was aimed at Tom and then the Mises Institute in general. And I read that, and my thought was, I actually might have posted that somewhere on social media. Was that that's great that he's taking the strong moral stance against slavery in the antebellum South. Congratulations. Here's your cookie. Now, Tom, on the other hand, has been outspoken against the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Syrian War, the Patriot Act, the lockdowns. This was pre-lockdown, but we can say that he's been outspoken against the lockdowns since then. Every other deprivation of human liberty that's committed by the American state right now, right here. That's true moral courage.
Yeah.
It takes no moral courage to oppose Southern slavery in 2000 and whatever year this was. This
you're right. It takes no moral courage, and it takes no moral courage. And the thing is now is we're now seeing people are already trying to pretend they never favored this stuff. Yeah, Yaron Brook at the Ayn Rand Institute is doing it. He's now trying to pretend that we were always opposed to this, and no, you weren't. And you're going to see some people try to pretend that it's just the same way feminists try to pretend. Feminists want to forget that they were also prohibitionists back in the 19 teens, and all the feminists were prohibitionists. They wanted to outlaw alcohol, and that's completely swept under the rug.
The history of the eugenics and the relationship between that and Planned Parenthood.
Yeah, I also should have brought this up earlier. Ron Paul was also somewhat involved with the Foundation for Economic Education, right?
Yes, I believe he was on their board for a number of years, and he was. I remember when he got involved in this, there was a handful of organizations, and FEE was probably the leading educational organization at the time. I think there was FEE, IHS, Intercollegiate Studies Institute on the more conservative side, and then there was National Review would occasionally run something by Hazlitt.
National Review would occasionally have an article. I mean, I remember they had an obituary for Margit von Mises when she died, written by Lew Rockwell, although Buckley was hostile toward Rothbard and he was hostile toward Ayn Rand. Did Ron Paul ever read any Ayn Rand?
I think he did. I think he did.
Yeah. Was there any?
Because I know he read he must have, because remember the Greenspan anecdote. He subscribed to the Objectivist newsletter because he had that article, that original copy of it with gold. Because remember back then there was only Ayn Rand was one of the most prominent promoters of our ideas. And there was Rand, and Friedman made it into the popular consciousness in the 60s. But Rand was promoting Austrian economics, the gold standards things. She was a fan of Mises. She wasn't a fan of Rothbard because they had a falling out, and she thought the whole anarchy thing was crazy. Also Rothbard's friend Leonard Liggio used to fall asleep on her couch, which she didn't appreciate.
Oh my gosh. I can imagine Ayn Rand dealing with somebody who falls asleep while she's talking. Oh my, Leonard Liggio, he's not still alive, is he?
No, he passed a few years ago.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, he was part of that as they call it, the Circle Bastiat, which included there was Leonard Liggio, there was Ralph Rako, there was Rothbard, there was George Reisman, who actually was one of the few who actually, I think, broke with Rothbard and went over to the objectivist side. And there might have been a few others, but yeah, that was and I know Reisman is still around, by the way. Although I haven't heard from him in years, I haven't heard anything about him dying. I'd love to get some of these really old guys onto this show if I could get them. Like George Reisman would be one. Israel Kirzner, who's also over 90. Thomas Sowell, he's also over 90. But and even Alan and Joan Mitchell Blumenthal, as far as I know, too, who are also in Ayn Rand's circle. But
we lost some.
What?
Leonard and Ralph.
Yeah. Well, Leonard Peikoff got her estate, but he was kind of a non-entity. But anyway, Norman. Well, do you have anything else you want to say before we go, Norman?
No, I don't. I just want to say just say that my writings on antitrust and problems with the Republicans, people like Josh Hawley, run regularly on Real Clear Markets. Sometimes on the Libertarian Institute. I hope everybody enjoyed this conversation, and hope maybe do it again. And happy Easter. And
yes. Hit like, subscribe. Also, the Monerotopia conference will be going on in Mexico City. That's go to monerotopia.com for that. Hit like, subscribe, hit like on the video, subscribe, and go buy my novel Escaping the Village. And also, I do want to recommend too for antitrust, Dominic Armentano's book, Antitrust: The Case for Repeal, is a good little book to read. It's quick and easy, pretty easy for people to understand. But and don't forget about Monerotopia next month. And I'm Chris Baker, and we are out. Thanks for coming on, Norman. It's been great having you.
Great. Thank you.